Welcome back. Well, in this particular segment, we're going to continue our discussion of the Moynihan report. We have made it to chapter 2, and we're discussing the state of the African American family, or the Negro family, as the report refers to. And we're going to get into the next subheading that talks about nearly a quarter of urban Negro marriages are dissolved. So what does that term dissolve mean? Well, when we get into it, we'll find out what that particular phrase means. But before we do, of course, you know what we're going to do. We're going to review what we learned in the beginning of chapter 2. And so as we review, one of the first things we come to find out about the information stated in chapter 2 is that the deterioration of the Negro community is basically because of the fact that the family unit of the African American society is beginning to deteriorate. And then we come to find out that really the basic unit of family life is used for socializing an individual. And that was a powerful phrase because what it teaches us is that what a person sees while they're young within the family, it serves to condition an individual as to how they will conduct themselves as an adult. So the things that you see while you're young, whether they're traumatic or not, will have an effect on you when you become an older adult. And so to have a stable family structure is to create an atmosphere where your children will have the best opportunity to have a rich and fulfilling life. And then the next thing that we went on to talk about is the two emerging classes within African American society. And those two emerging classes are not based upon the morals and the principles that individuals might abide by. It has more to do with their having of resources and where they are financially. And so those two particular classes we come to see were the emerging middle class that's growing fast and being productive, and the stagnant lower class, right? And so in connection with those two particular classes, we found out that there were two errors that a person could make, or two errors that had been made in the past in regards to looking at the community as a whole. The first error is that when you look at the middle class and how well it's doing and how much progress it's making, a lot of individuals have the tendency to judge the whole community just by the middle class. And when you do that, you end up ignoring the difficulties of the lower class individuals. And there are some difficulties that exist among the lower class individuals that most definitely need to be addressed. And then the second mistake is when averaging. And in this particular instance, that's exactly what they're doing, because they're mentioning a statistical measurement. So what you're doing, you're taking the statistics from one group, the lower class group, and the middle class group, and you're averaging them together. And what's happening is the overwhelming progress that the middle class is making overshadows the lower class. And so in both instances, it would appear that the African American community is making strides in order to be better in this society. But that's a facade. There are some difficulties that exist, as I mentioned, that have to be addressed. They can't be overlooked, because if they are overlooked, then the deterioration of the Negro community will continue, without a doubt. So why am I saying that? Why are we putting so much emphasis on the Negro family, or the African American family, and the African American community? Because that's the basis of what this paper is trying to do. It's trying to find the difficulties involved and, quite frankly, try to propose a solution. So now, speaking of one of the difficulties, let's get into the first subheading on page 6 of the Moynihan report. It is in chapter 2, And as I mentioned, that subheading is nearly a quarter of urban Negro marriages are dissolved. So as I mentioned, what does that term mean, dissolved? What does it mean for someone to have a marriage that is dissolved? Well, in the first paragraph, it helps us to appreciate that this means that the woman in this particular instance would either be divorced, separated, or she'd be living apart from her husband. So now we have that. There's the precedent. Divorced, separated, living apart from her husband. So keep that in mind, okay? And in this particular segment that we're going to do, there are two graphs that we're going to take consideration of. And we'll get to those graphs in just a moment. But now what I want to do is provide some background information in regards to the data that the graphs provide, okay? So now in looking at the percentages all over the country, we come to find out that in the Northeast, 26% of African-American women have their marriages dissolved. They're either divorced, separated, or they're living apart from their husband. So that's in the Northeast. That's 26%. In the urban frontier, in the inner cities, I should say, it gives an example of in New York City in 1960, 30.2%. 30.2%. And that 30.2% does not include divorces. It only includes women who are separated or living apart from their husband. Now, if you were to add the divorces to that particular percentage, it would go much, much higher. Okay. And then if you look at the average percentage from 1950 to 1960, you'll see that from all age groups, the proportion of husbands being present in the household is declining. It's declining at every age group. So there is a pronounced difficulty here. Men are not within their household to the same degree that their white counterparts are. Why do I say that? Because the report goes on to mention that although a similar decline happened within the white community from 1950 to 1960, I want you to notice a point that it makes. It says the proportion of white husbands present never dropped below 90%, except for the first and last age group. The first age group is 15 to 19, and the last is 40 to 44. It never dropped below 90%. Never dropped. So what you're looking at is 10% of the population in regards to white Americans. 10% of women have to deal with being or being involved in dissolved marriages, being separated or being divorced or being apart from their husband. So now, as I mentioned, we have some charts that we need to look at and consider. And so I'll get those up. Let's see what we got. All right. So now the first chart there is, it's entitled Percent Distribution of Ever Married Females with Husbands Absent or Divorced, Rural through Urban in 1960. And so it's broken down by non-white and white, the different areas: urban, rural, non-farm, and rural farm. And so we have some very telling numbers, but what's important to us, what's of interest to us, are the numbers that lie right beside where it says total husbands absent or divorced. So that's that third line. Now notice that for non-whites in urban areas, it's 22.9. For whites in urban areas, it's 7.9. For non-whites in rural non-farm areas, it's 14.7. And for rural non-farm whites, it's 5.7. And then you have in the rural farm area, non-whites come in at 9.6 and whites come in at 3. So now, why did I bring that particular line to our attention? Because in every instance, whether it's urban, rural non-farm, or rural farm, if you look at the proportions between non-whites and whites, the non-white proportion almost triples the white proportion. Do you see that? In urban, if you round that to the nearest number, you get 23 and 8, almost triple. And then if you go to the rural non-farm, 15 and 6, almost triple. And then in the rural farm areas, 10 and 3, that is triple. So it's clear there is a disparity when it comes to individuals when it comes to their husband being present. There was a difficulty back in 1960 when they took the percentage distribution here. In all areas, there were what seems to be a lack of non-white men being present in their households, right? So let's go to the next particular graph and let's see what we can learn from it. I told you all we had a couple of charts that we need to look at. Okay, now this particular chart talks about the percentage of women with husbands that are absent. So now what I want you to notice is on the non-white side, the report makes it clear that the average is closer to a quarter, closer to 25%, right? But if you notice on the non-white side, the total amount of individuals who are living without their husbands or with their husbands being absent, you'll notice that consistently from 1950 to 1964, consistently it is above 15%. Consistently. And I want you to keep that number in mind, okay? It's consistently above 15%. So 15% of non-white women from 1950 to 1964, 15% consistently are without their husbands, right? Their husbands are absent from family life. Well, what about whites? With the exception of 1954 and 1955, you notice that usually they don't even meet 5%. They don't even meet 5%. So as I mentioned, the absence of husbands in the family is almost triple for non-whites when it compared to whites. So just to put both of these charts, just to put them in the right perspective, how can you possibly build a community without a family? And moreover, how can you possibly build a family without a husband? Now, I know that notion is probably mundane and prehistoric now, but the truth of the matter is you cannot build a family, a nuclear family, in the sense that we're talking about, without a husband. The husband fills a particular role, the wife fills a particular role, and both of their roles together help to steer the children in the way that they should go. As we mentioned now, as we learned in the first part of chapter 2, the home life that a child experiences will cause them to see life through the particular lens that they're exposed to. And so it's necessary to have both parents present so that children understand their role and how they should conduct themselves. They know what proper socialization looks like because they were exposed to it as a child. And so as they get older and they become adults, there's no difficulty in trying to figure out where they fit in into society because they have those roles clear in mind because they had two loving parents that taught them what their roles were. Now, does that make sense? I hope that it does. And so, like I mentioned, these numbers are startling. They are. Almost a quarter of non-white women in 1960 didn't have husbands in the household. Their marriages were dissolved. They were either separated, divorced, or living apart from their husband. And that alone would have a profound effect on the fabric of their community. Because as we mentioned, there are certain things that the husband is geared toward teaching, certain things that the wife is geared toward teaching. And if either one is missing, then there is an imbalance in the home. And if that imbalance is replicated enough in the community, and then it starts to affect the fabric of that community. And that's what we're seeing. Okay? So now, in conclusion, what can we say? Well, what we can say is that absolutely those charts and numbers paint a bleak picture of home life for most of African American children in the 1960s. The report actually is talking about 1950 to 1964. And so it paints a bleak picture of family life. And so it's not an overestimation to say that the fabric of the African American family is deteriorating. At this particular time, it absolutely was. The absence of fathers was running rampant, and the families of these particular absent fathers were suffering as a result. That's not anything that's laced with emotion. That's just simply pure and honest fact. So next week, we're going to continue talking about family life and some of the primary components of the family. We'll be talking about nearly 1/4 of Negro births are now illegitimate. All right. So that's what we'll be discussing next week. And I hope that you'll come back so that we can continue the discussion. And I hope that you enjoyed the information that we've just dispensed. All right. We will see you next week. Be easy.